So today our speaker is Richard Donnelly. He is a deputy editor of our journal, the International Socialism Journal, and he is also a postgraduate researcher in conspiracy theories and the far right. Over to you, Richard.
Wow, comrades and friends, what a day. Yeah, I'm sure everyone is very, very happy to be rid of the yoke of conservatism for a little while. Welcome to the first liberated session of Marxism for 15 years. Can people hear me? That's what?
It's a Starmerite plot.
It begins here. Now, one consequence of it being extraordinarily exciting is that I woke up extremely early to look at all of the results, which means that I'm a bit worse for wear, so people are going to have to bear with me a little bit if I spend a lot of time looking at my notes today. But, okay, I'll start off. Usually when I tell people that I'm studying conspiracy theories, they want to talk to me about the most wacky ones that they know. So I thought I'd go through some of them to begin off. The first slide. People might know about this one. Do people know about this one? Birds aren't real? Wonderful, wonderful. It's a little bit of a trick because it's not truly believed by anyone, or at least not that many people. This one believed by slightly more people. Paul McCartney died in a car accident in 1966, and he was replaced by a doppelganger for the rest of the Beatles' career, which would explain the frog song. The next picture. The idea that the Earth is actually hollow and can be accessed by an entrance in the city of Lichfield in Staffordshire. Which is truly believed by people. Now, despite all of this wackiness, the truth is that conspiracy theories in recent times, and I'm going to argue over the past 200 years actually, but particularly at the moment have taken on a very pervasive and sinister role. A much more sinister role than these marginal conspiracy theories that I started off with. Around a third of the US population today believes that the 2020 presidential election was actually rigged in order to ensure that Donald Trump lost. And of course this is a major factor in American politics. The idea of cultural Marxism, a conspiracy theory developed originally by the Nazis, called by the Nazis Kulturbolschewismus, which claims that Jewish Marxist intellectuals are working through liberal political forces in order to overthrow Western civilization. This has been repeated by leading conservative politicians such as Suella Braverman and Mariam Cates, as well as by this man, who people will know, Ted Cruz, a leading Republican. Are we clapping Ted Cruz? Oh no, we're clapping Jess. Good work, Jess. Fuck Ted Cruz. The next image. The idea of a great replacement, with migrants from Africa and the Middle East being deliberately introduced into Europe and North America in order to replace white people. This is an ideology which is now central, not just to the far right, but to many even radicalising mainstream right-wing parties in Europe and North America today. Moreover, the politics of the pandemic, if we cast our mind back then, was in many ways infused and shaped by conspiracist movements such as the QAnon movement in the United States, the anti-vax movement in different parts of the world as well. Now here I want to look specifically at the history of conspiracy theories in capitalist societies, and especially a phenomenon which I'm going to refer to as the conspiracist tradition, a tradition that begins with the French Revolution and flows right up to the present day with QAnon, with the Great Reset, with the Great Replacement and all of the rest of it. First, however, I think that we need to explore what a conspiracy theory is, because the answer is simply not as obvious as one might expect. In 2018, The Guardian published a very interesting study into the prevalence of conspiracy theories in Britain. And as you can see, the results were pearl-clutchingly shocking, comrades. The results found that 60%, a full 60% of British people believe in a conspiracy theory. The problem, however, with this research is shown by the next slide. It's the definition of a conspiracy theory. Because the most widespread conspiracy theory in Britain, according to the research, shared by 44% of the population, was this: even though we live in what's called a democracy, a few people will always run things in this country anyway. Now, I think you might be able to see the problem here. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's an accurate description of a capitalist society. It's a basic statement of fact, and I'm very surprised that no more than 44% of people agree with this. I don't quite believe it, to be honest. We live in a capitalist society, and this means that the power is concentrated in the hands of unelected but extraordinarily influential people, the executives of the major corporations, the senior civil servants, the head of the military and the police, the editors of the major newspapers. We might have had a change of government today, but none of these people will change today because they are completely unelected. And the Guardian example here, I think, shows the ideologically loaded nature of the concept of conspiracy theory. The idea of conspiracy theory has always been used as a way of policing political discussion, which is actually shown by the people who developed the idea in the middle of the 20th century. It's not a particularly old concept, by the way. The first theorists to develop the idea of the concept of conspiracy theory were two men called Karl Popper and, in America, Douglas Hofstadter, who were liberal political philosophers. Popper said that conspiracism was the enemy of the open society, or the ideology of the enemies of the open society, and he believed Marxists to also be conspiracy theorists. But then he would say that, wouldn't he? Yet despite this, it's clear that conspiracy theories are real and that they have a big impact on history. You have only to think about the Nazi conspiracy theory. At the heart of the ideology of the Nazi project, that Jews are attempting to gain world domination and therefore have to be exterminated. Or in a quite different context, the Stalinist conspiracy theory that a secret alliance of Trotskyists and fascists were trying to rip down the 5-year plan and destroy Soviet socialism. And these conspiracy theories led to real and terrible crimes. The Holocaust, the Stalin's Great Purges, and so on and so forth. So what are conspiracy theories? Well, conspiracy theory diverges from a healthy skepticism towards how reality is presented by mainstream politicians, mainstream press, and so on, is in that it sees the world as fundamentally structured by conspiracy. You see, conspiracies are real, and they happen every single day by powerful people at the top of our society, because we live under capitalism. It's a tiny minority who owns all of the wealth, and they have very different interests to the mass of the population, and out of that comes a tendency towards backroom deals, towards secret conversations, and periodically these emerge as scandals into public life, but in truth we probably don't know half of it. However, conspiracy theories see this conspiratorial action, these backroom deals, this personal contact, as the central organising factor in society. And thus, rather than offering a structural explanation of how the system is organised, they argue that there's an in-group at the top of society, an elite group, that directly controls the rest of society through conspiracy amongst themselves and through personal contact with one another. Now, here another distinction is quite helpful. A lot of interest exists around what can be called event conspiracy theories. These are theories surrounding specific historical episodes such as the moon landings and the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It's a very, very old social phenomenon, actually. This is an image portraying the lepers plot in 1321. This was an idea spread around southern France that the lepers were plotting to contaminate water supplies with poison, resulting in lepers being tortured, destroying leper colonies, riots against lepers and all of the rest of it. Very, very similar to the idea of blood libel. A Christian child disappears, the local Jewish population is blamed for it. It's said that the child was abducted in order to be the subject of satanic ritual abuse because Jews are actually Satanists, blah, 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 blah. This is very common phenomenon in the Middle Ages that people will probably know about. However, what I'm going to be concerned with here is the question of systematic conspiracy theories rather than conspiracy theories about singular events. Systematic conspiracy theories allege that the whole of society is somehow controlled by a singular plot. And these theories have taken a large number of forms over time. from ideas about secret societies and the Freemasons and the Illuminati during the French Revolution and up to today, actually, to the idea of a world Jewish conspiracy, to more recent ideas about the New World Order, the Great Reset, the Great Replacement, and so on. And in fact, what I'm going to argue is that these theories form a more or less unbroken tradition that goes back several hundred years, with each new iteration of this conspiracism borrowing from the systematic conspiracy theories that came before it. And I'm going to refer to this, as I said, as the conspiracist tradition. Now, there's three things, and there's a slide for each of them. Number one, the emergence of conspiracism, this conspiracist tradition, is more or less contemporaneous with the development of capitalism. And I believe that this is for a very, very important reason. Conspiracy theories play an important part in people's understanding sometimes of capitalism, because capitalism is a complex system that is organised by impersonal forces which are difficult to understand and which have no direct agency behind them. And therefore, in order to better understand them, there is a tendency towards trying to attribute personal agency to them, trying to understand them as the effect of a person or a group of persons who stands behind events. Second, because conspiracy theories are concerned with trying to understand why major social changes happen, the emergence of new conspiracist movements tend to be associated with the backlash to revolutionary movements. So as we'll see, modern conspiracism really starts as a reaction to the French Revolution. There's a new phase of it after the liberal revolutions in Europe in the 1840s, where it develops into a form of anti-Semitic conspiracism. After the First World War and the Russian Revolution, you have this new iteration of it, Judeo-Bolshevism, the idea that Jews and the Bolsheviks are part of a singular conspiracy. And there's later iterations after that, which I'm going to go on to. And also, the changes in conspiracism, the new waves of it, are also linked to crises of capitalism, technological change, social change, financial crisis, and all of the other types of social dislocation which are caused by capitalism. Third, although conspiracy theories can be articulated by the left, they can be articulated by the centre. You know, Putin put Trump into office, if you really look at the evidence, apparently. Or by the right, the truth is that overwhelmingly conspiracism is a phenomenon of the right wing, a phenomenon of reaction, associated in the French Revolution with Catholicism and monarchism, associated in the late 19th century with aristocratic conservatism, with anti-liberalism, associated after the First World War with the rise of fascism, with the Nazis and so on, and after the Second World War, associated, intimately bound up with the history of the far right, the post-war far right. Now, I'm going to go on to the history now. This man is a man called Augustin Borel, and Borel was a Jesuit priest, and he was a royalist before the French Revolution, and due to those two facts, he had to leave France during the Revolution. People will remember that the Catholic Church was repressed, that many priests were arrested and killed, etc. And he fled to England, where he won attention for a book about the suppression of the Catholic Church, which was used to bolster opposition to the French Revolution in England. However, Borel's lasting mark was another work, which is called Memoirs Illustrating the History of Jacobinism, the Anti-Social Conspiracy, which says that the French Revolution was not caused as a result of the upwelling of popular opposition to the monarchy and to the aristocracy, nor to the enormous opulence and arrogance of the ruling class in France, but it was actually the handiwork of a small group of conspirators who pulled the strings behind the scenes. According to Borel, the purpose of the sedition was not only to destroy the monarchy, not only to create a republic in France, but actually to undermine society itself and to plunge the world into anarchy. Far more evil intentions. And interestingly, Borel argued that the heart of the conspiracy was a group called the Illuminati. Now, when I found this out, I was shocked and surprised and amazed. Because when I started encountering conspiracy theories as a person, in England over the past few decades, you run into the idea of the Illuminati all the time. It's the central idea, apart from anti-Semitism, for example, in the work of David Icke, who's the most notorious and famous conspiracist in this country. This man was talking about this 130 years ago, and it hasn't gone away yet, which is quite incredible. Particularly because, I don't know whether people know this, but the Illuminati were a real organisation, but we know that they had nothing to do with the French Revolution. We've proved it. Much historical evidence had to be amassed in order to find this out, but we've proved it because they ceased to exist before the revolution happened. 3 years before the revolution happened. The reason that he identified the Illuminati in this way is because they were actually essentially progressive liberals at the time. They were a band of progressive liberals in the Kingdom of Bavaria who were opposed to torture, were opposed to monarchy, etc., etc. All fine things at the time. Liberals aren't what they used to be. Nonetheless, Burrell's book became the basis for a whole tradition that sees the hidden hand of the Illuminati and other secret societies, especially the Freemasons, behind major political events. And it's important to note here that when we talk about secret societies in this period, we're not talking about societies that were actually secret. The meaning of a secret society in the early 19th century is just that it's not subsumed underneath a major societal institution such as the state, the church, etc. They're independent organisations for liberal free thinkers to a greater or lesser extent. So the association which is being drawn really is with the idea of liberal revolutionism, and the idea that behind the French Revolution lies something much darker. And this is why, he also talks about the Freemasons. The Freemasons were associated to some extent, it was a mixed bag, but to some extent with the radical democratic traditions in continental Europe. Their members included, for example, Toussaint Louverture, the man who led the Haitian Revolution, as well as the revolutionary leader Georges Danton in France. Now, the emergence of this conspiracism from the work of Burrell marked the beginning of a tradition of attributing secret agency to the social transformation of Europe, which at this time was being brought about by the emergence of capitalism on continental Europe and all of the social changes that was bringing about. These theories suggested that all of these changes that were happening as a result of the emergence of capitalism, the undermining of traditional forms of feudal authority, the undermining of the power of the church, the growth of atheism, the breakdown of more traditional forms of the patriarchal family associated with the peasant way of life, the empowerment of the urban masses, and as we'll see, the emancipation of Jewish people, were not part of deep historical processes, but were actually laid out in advance by a shadowy plot by Freemasons, dark satanic powers, and so on and so forth. Now, from the beginning, conspiracism developed as a reaction to the modernising effects of capitalism, as I've said, and because of this, over the course of the 19th century, it intertwined with another major ideological form of reaction towards the liberal revolutions that were taking place in the development of capitalism at that time. I'm here talking about anti-Semitism. Jews were very much associated with the rise of the liberal order in Europe, not so much because they had some sort of major role in bringing it about, but because it led to their emancipation. The French Revolution emancipated the Jews in France. In 1806, Napoleon convokes this Congress, which is called the Grand Sanhedrin, which is about integrating Jewish people into French society. And over the course of the 19th century, you get the liberation of Jewish people out of the ghettos. And because of this, in the minds of reactionaries at the time, Jews are singled out as the symbol of degeneracy, the symbol of this new social order which is rotting away at the traditional institutions, the traditional social ties that exist in Europe at that time. And this is intensified particularly by the global financial crisis of 1873. The first large global crisis of the capitalist system, which results in this long depression for many decades, in which the Jews are more and more blamed as the shadowy force that caused this financial crisis or associated with the financial system and so on. Now, the conspiracism put forward by Burrell dovetailed very, very easily with this form of anti-Semitism. However, it wasn't until much later in the 19th century that what the academics call the Jewish world domination thesis, which is a rather odd name for it. But anyway, the idea that Jews are working in secret to take over the world really comes into its own. And the founding figure in this line of conspiracism is this man, a man called Hermann Gutsche, a very, very terrible man, despite the fantastic facial hair. Gutsche was a postal official, and he was a state asset of the Kingdom of Prussia in the 1848 revolution. His job was essentially to fabricate letters that could be used to frame the leaders of the liberal democratic revolution in Germany at the time, and then, you know, pretend that he discovered them in the post room or whatever. It's interesting how many of these people are conspiracists, but they're actually engaged in conspiracies themselves. I won't go into that. But in 1868, he wrote a book that's entitled Biarritz, under a fake name, John Ratcliffe. He thought that people would believe him more if he had an English name. And a chapter of this book describes the meeting of a secret rabbinical cabal made up of representatives of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the elders of the 12 tribes meet in this graveyard, right? Made more famous by Umberto Eco's book, the Prague Graveyard, the Prague Cemetery, where I think he draws on this. But anyway, that's by the by. They come together in this cemetery and they talk about their efforts to bring Jewish domination to the entire world. And the methods by which they say that they're pursuing this are very, very telling. Many of the effects of the development of capitalism and of impersonal market forces that have been unleashed by capitalism in the book are attributed to the conscious plotting of these Jewish leaders. So, for example, Judah, the guy representing the tribe of Judah, he says that he's responsible for reducing skilled artisans to impoverished factory workers. There you go. It wasn't the Industrial Revolution, it was this guy. Simeon, he has the task of breaking up the great aristocratic estates so that they can be brought under the control of the Jewish capitalists. Reuben has the responsibility for Jewish control over the stock exchanges, whereby the Jews place all the national states and secular authorities in their debt, and thus under their control. Levi, his goal is to undermine Christianity by promoting secularism and hostility towards the clergy. Now, while Gutsche's novel is not particularly well known in itself, it becomes the basis for the most influential conspiracist document in history, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The protocols were written, or rather assembled, by the Okhrana. For those who don't know, the Okhrana was the secret service in Tsarist Russia before the Tsarist system was overthrown by the Soviets in 1917. And they basically took elements of Gutsche's novel, they mixed it with other fragments of other anti-Semitic texts which had been produced. This is in about 1902, 1903. And they sought to use this as an explanation of the rise of forces such as liberalism, socialism, feminism, secularism in Tsarist Russia, all of the social forces which were opposed to the dominance of the Tsar and of the aristocrats. The book is used as a way of claiming that all of these social forces are being manipulated by the Jews in order to destroy Russian society and to bring about Jewish domination over the Russian people. And, you know, as you'll know, probably, during this period, anti-Semitism was a really key pillar of the imperial regime in Russia. Millions of Jewish people had to flee. And some claim that the Protocols was written to provide an explanation, or rather to discredit in advance, the revolution which the Russian state authorities expected, and which did actually break out in 1905 and really challenged the regime. However, the Protocols were soon translated into many languages and republished across Europe and North America. And in each national context, I think this is kind of interesting, in each national context, well, it's the same book, it takes on a slightly different role in far-right ideology in that national context. So, for example, it really becomes a mass circulation publication in Germany after the First World War. Why? Because it acts as an explanation of why the Germans lost the First World War. The Jews manipulated the socialist movement, they manipulated the feminists, they manipulated the working class in order to overthrow the Kaiser and to bring an end to the war so that Jews could take control of Germany. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Protocols were popularised by one Henry Ford, the founder of the modern industrial system. Henry Ford, of course, he was the famous founder of the Ford Motor Company. And he bought a national newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, and he serialised the protocols in it. And he also published a book called The International Jew, which was based on it. Now, the Jewish, and in this context, he tries to use it as a way of explaining why it is that Puritan values in America are breaking down. It's not as a result of the Industrial Revolution that's taking place at that time. No, it's as a result of Jewish influence. Okay. Now, the Jewish world domination idea embodied in the protocols became extremely widespread across the Western world at this point. Today, we associate it mostly with the Nazis and with their present-day imitators, but it was actually much more widely accepted on the right in order to than this would suggest, especially after the Bolsheviks carried through the socialist revolution in Russia in 1917. So I'm going to show you two quotes. This is from 1921. This man is Wickham Steed, and he was the editor of the Times newspaper at the time, the Times of London. And he said of the protocols, "What are these protocols? Are they authentic? If so, what malevolent assembly concocted these plans and gloated over their exposition? Or are they a forgery? If so, whence comes the uncanny note of prophecy? Prophecy in part already fulfilled, in part so far gone in the way of fulfillment." So, obviously think, even if it is a forgery, well, it's pretty accurate. But anyway, in the same year, Winston Churchill wrote an article about the supposed historic Bolshevism of the Jewish people, listing leading Jews associated with the revolutionary working class movements breaking out across the world. And he says this: "The movement amongst the Jews is not new. From the days of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky in Russia, Bela Kun, Rosa Luxemburg, Emma Goldman in the United States, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstruction of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malice, of impossible equality, has been steadily growing. It has been the mainspring of every subversive moment since the 19th century." Quite shocking that Winston Churchill believed this stuff, but he did. And this is an example of the sort of Judeo-Bolshevism ideology which you get between the two world wars, in which it said that the Jews are actually the evil power which is lying behind the Russian Revolution. Again, an example of the way in which, after revolutionary waves, you can often get this new form of reiterated conspiracism that meets the demands of the situation at that time. Now, one of the results of a characterisation of the Jews in this way, as a force that wants to dominate the whole world, as a force which is evil, that is Machiavellian, that is the evil which lies behind every other social ill, means that it becomes a license for genocide. And this is precisely what happens in Nazi Germany. And the anti-Semitic conspiracism of the Nazi Party was very, very important to the ideology and organisation of the Nazi Party and its statecraft. It performed a number of different functions. It identified a bogeyman around which the Nazis and the Nazi state could mobilise. It delegitimised the German Revolution of 1918, which the Nazis sought to roll back. It allowed, most importantly, I think, it allowed the Nazis to present liberal capitalism and communism as actually two sides of the same coin, as two parts of a single Jewish conspiracy. This is very, very important when you understand that the base of the Nazi Party were middle-class people who were opposed to both big capital and to the socialist movement. So this conspiracism gave them a coherent. Okay, I can't think of a better word. A coherent ideological framework around which to organise their movement. It becomes extremely important in Nazi ideology and the way in which they organise the party. I'm going to bring this up to the present day by lighting on a couple of important far-right conspiracies at the moment and just pointing to the ways quickly in which they fulfil some of the same functions that this form of conspiracism has played throughout history, or at least over the past 200 years. Because with the fall of Nazism and the exposure of the Holocaust, ideas such as eugenics, race science, the idea of Jewish world domination, like these ideas were discredited inside of the mainstream in society in the Western countries. After the Second World War, far fewer right-wing political currents openly preached the worst forms of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But they continue to be interwoven in conspiracy theories today. So, for example, QAnon, the American conspiracy movement that came about during the pandemic, it's often not presented directly in terms of a Jewish world conspiracy, but it references previous forms of conspiratorial anti-Semitism. So, for example, there's an idea that the world is partially controlled by the Rothschilds family. And of course, this is actually an idea which you confronted in the Occupy encampments in 2010, actually. So it's not even it's not confined to the far right. It can somehow spill out of that.
Sorry, can you speak to the mic?
Oh, I'm sorry. But this conspiracy theory is rooted in Nazi propaganda. This is a Nazi propaganda film called Die Rothschilds, the Rothschilds, which talks about the history of the Rothschilds' plan to conquer the globe. But what's going on here is that this sort of move gives plausible deniability against allegations of anti-Semitism, while at the same time referencing a conspiracy theory that was actually popularised by the Nazis. So this is a very important thing that's going on at the present time. And you see it also with George Soros. George Soros is, of course, a Jewish billionaire financier who funds liberal political causes across the West. And for the modern far right, he's the Jewish puppet master who controls the liberal establishment, basically. In this image, this is actually outside of the West, but this is an Indian poster produced by the BJP, the far-right party that's in control of India. And this shows George Soros as the puppet master of Rahul Gandhi, who, of course, is the leader of the other large Indian party. Thank you very much. And the Great Replacement is the idea that the elites, often with Soros being identified as their leader, are deliberately importing non-white people into Europe and North America in order to replace the indigenous population. So even when the theory is not explicitly associated with Soros or the Jews, it continues to retain some of the basic outlines and functions of earlier anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So, for example, the Great Replacement, it allows the far right to claim that the capitalist establishment and the left are actually on the same side, because apparently they're both in favour of open borders, but tell that to the people who are trying to cross the channel. The Great Replacement also acts as an explanation for wider social phenomenon in a period of capitalist crisis. So, for example, it says that the low birth rate in Western countries is not caused by the deteriorating social conditions of working class people and the increased freedom of women in our society, but it's actually the result of a deliberate strategy to drive down the white population so that it can be replaced by black people. And thus feminism is painted as an establishment effort to convince women that they don't need to have children, or convince white women that they don't need to have children. You see the same basic functions and outlines that this sort of thing is playing in terms of far-right organisation. Identifying enemies, saying that the far right is an alternative both to the liberal establishment and to the far left, and so on and so forward. And I learned here, these are no longer marginal ideas, as I indicated at the beginning. Far-right conspiracy theories are going mainstream in a way that they haven't, maybe since the rise of conspiratorial anti-Semitism in the 1920s, if we rule out McCarthyism in the 1950s. It's likely that the next president of the United States will be Donald Trump, a man who has blamed Soros for migrant caravans and for paying demonstrators to protest during the Black Lives Matter movement. Similarly, the next Tory leader could easily be a figure such as Suella Braverman, who has used her position as Home Secretary to promote elements of the Great Replacement theory, who's talked about cultural Marxism and so on. And I think my hope here is to give a bit of an introduction to this history of conspiracy theories to frame a bigger discussion, really. And I hope that people will come in, I'm sure there's learned people who will come and tell us more about the history, but also I'm hoping that some people will come up and talk about their experience of actually confronting these ideas head on at the moment, which is always a frustrating experience, but I'd like to hear your experience of it.
You briefly mentioned McCarthyism. You mentioned it in passing. What I've read, and I believe this to be true, is that Senator McCarthy, when he was holding his hearings, and he was talking about Reds under the bed and going after communists in the administration, I've heard from commentators that in fact his true target was actually Jews, because he disproportionately targeted Jewish people. And if you look into the people who he actually targeted and who wanted to ruin their lives and their careers, there are actually Jews on the who were leftists, who were communists. They happened to be communists, but his real intention was not to go after communists, but to go after Jews in the administration. Could you please comment on that?
with a lot of conspiracy theories, I think where they take hold is when they reflect a world in crisis to a great extent, that people feel, you know, sort of a world that's out of control, they're disempowered, they don't feel they can shape it, they then go for various forms of ideas that seem to explain it to them. And I think it's important that when people have, have a belief in conspiracy theories, however you want to define them, they are still beliefs, and quite often they are genuine beliefs of people. So I do think a wrong approach for them sometimes is to just dismiss it as nonsense, or just to say as an outright when we're having a discussion or debates with people. It's not to concede the theories at all, but it is. But I don't think we should be dismissive of people when we're engaged in those kind of arguments. And I also think it's important to look at them when we're talking to individuals on a case-by-case basis. I think there's different degrees of it in people's ideas, and I'm struck quite often how they can run alongside other ideas which we would agree with. I mean, sometimes you come across people and it's very deep-rooted, it's very systematic, they're racist, they're anti-Semitic, etc., etc. With other people, it's not at the same degree, and I think the idea of sometimes a contradictory consciousness of the way in which that people can have a partial view of the world and an opposition to elements of the world, but also then are vulnerable, for want of a better expression, into taking up these kind of ideas, which I think reflect their sense of a lack of power to change society. And I think similarly, a lot of sometimes these ideas can be undermined by being part of social movements that give confidence, give a sense of an ability to change the world, and you're then less likely, I think, to lapse into those kind of conspiratorial ideas.
I guess I wanted to ask a bit of a question, really, is how we respond on the left, because as we've seen, it often conspiracism seems to tie in very closely with the far right, which we're deeply opposed to. And also, as if comments on a case-by-case basis, how you dispute this with people that believe in these conspiracy theories. Because often, whether it's QAnon or any of these other anti-Semitic or racist they're designed to be, the theories themselves are designed to be unfalsifiable to an extent. Which means, if you offer logical evidence to dispute that to someone, in response you'll usually get something along the lines of, "Oh, that's just what they want you to think," and that makes it incredibly difficult to get through to people who fall victim to these theories. So I'm wondering, I guess, just what the best sort of collective response from the left would be.
In Manchester, there is a quite large group of people who go around with huge big placards, supposedly purporting us to tell us about all the people who died from the COVID vaccine, and they set up camp in the city centre against whichever shop happens to be closed down at the time. The anti-vaccine conspiracies go right back to the 18th century. They, in fact, have great longevity since the Jenner and his somewhat unethical experiments, you might say, that discovered and launched the effect of the smallpox vaccine, what became, and the idea that this might turn people into semi-bovine creatures with heads and so on. There's quite a lot of currency, apparently. So there are a lot of long-standing ones. But the point I wanted to make is where some of these conspiracies overlap dangerously with the real world and are deliberately fomented. I mean, for instance, the idea that large numbers of people wish to cross the Channel to reach the UK or use other routes to move around within Europe is caused and promoted and brought about by people smugglers. Now, Tories who are persistently telling us this, it's not a conspiracy theory as such, but it's the launching of a myth. In the speaker's phrase, they're attributing a huge agency to a group who are involved, of course, in the movement of refugees and migrants, people smugglers, people who are in it for their own gain, if you like. But they're not the motive force. They're not the reason why people put themselves People are not duped and persuaded by people smugglers to get into large improvised dinghies, etc. They wish to do so. They have their own agency. But the Tories constantly refer to this, and Keir Starmer echoes it, and there will need to be measures brought in, says Starmer, to smash the smuggling gangs and so on, which is completely looking at the problem from the wrong end of the telescope. So it seems to me that, you know, rather than a marauding bunch of anti-vaxxers touring the city centre of Manchester, etc., the real dangers are where people, right-wingers for their own purposes, launch ideas, notions, almost conspiracies, that they must know to be untrue, and yet act as a very effective smokescreen for some people to look away and ignore the real problem and sweep aside our attempts to generate support for refugees and migrants.
Years ago, the BNP marched through Preston. Some of us counter-demonstrated by walking along both sides of them with the police in between. I made eye contact with the BNP and shouted at him, "Are you a worker? You should seek common cause with your fellow workers." And he replied to me, "Been reading your Jew papers, have you?" Right? Jewish conspiracy theory, there on the street. Alive now. Right. I mainly want to talk about the protocols. Like everybody else, I've heard of the protocols. I've been reliably informed they were a notorious Tsarist forgery, but I have never read the protocols because I never had access to a copy. A conspiracist that I knew thought it mattered that I had not read them. He thought it would make some difference, and I said I haven't had access to a copy. Eventually, I did find at least an extract from the protocols on the internet, and I read it. And I could see for myself that it is a notorious Tsarist forgery. You know, rabbis do not call themselves elders of Zion. These protocols I read had a very interesting message. The message was clearly, we already control the world. We, the Jews, already control the world, and we are going to use our already existing control of the world in order to, guess what, gain control of the world. In other words, it was completely contradictory. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit about a really common conspiracy theory in a minute, which is that doctors are trying to turn children trans, which is very weird, because there's a very big conspiracy to force children to be cis. I don't know if everybody knows this. Because you're assigned a gender at birth and then told you can't shift from that, and if you tell anybody, then your entire family is going to find out and we're going to stop you anyway, no matter how supportive everybody is. And it's peddled really strongly by all elements of the British state, of the media and so on. This idea of trans people don't exist, or they're all abusers and so on and so forth. And I think what's really kind of shocking about it is that outside of the left, outside of on the streets, there isn't really a challenge to it. When you see like the conspiracy theories that Richard talks about, a lot of them are very, very marginalised, and elements of the state and elements of the liberal left will try to create a counter-narrative. But the whole narrative about trans people, I think, is extra dangerous at the minute, especially if you look at the Cass report, which is part of that. I think if you're talking about anti-vax stuff, the Cass report really has strong echoes of Andrew Wakefield's report against vaccines and vaccines called autism, supposedly. And yet, the Cass report was supported by LGBT charities, either in part or in its entirety. That's why the power for us is outside those institutions, outside the state, and it's on the streets where we can actually build a movement against it. We can unite struggles, and we can point out the flaws in these issues and really develop a class consciousness that fights against conspiracy theories that oppress us and align with oppressors, and fight against the capitalist system that is actually conspiring against us.
One of the points that I think about conspiracy theories that I find really interesting at the moment is the impact on women, and I don't know if other people have similar experiences, but certainly in Erskine, some of the most kind of so, I'm trying to think of the word, but they were so into the conspiracy theories, were a group of women who genuinely believed that they were protecting young women in the area. And some of the conspiracy theories became extremely bizarre, including believing that Jewish people were putting paths around roundabouts to try and make a cashless society. And there's a kind of links between different conspiracy theories, and that's all related to asylum seekers in a hotel. It doesn't make sense, but when you read the information that they're putting out, there's a great deal of fear from these women. It's not excusing them. I despise them. I'm Jewish. I was absolutely attacked by them every single day. However, I think it's important for us to recognise that when there is fear and despair and alienation in society, people look for explanations. And if there is not a left movement there to provide the explanations, then actually people can turn to these kind of conspiracy theories, obviously fueled by far-right organisations that enter the area. But I think it's really important as well because it's also affected women in a different way, which the comment before me was speaking about trans rights, and I'm not by any means saying that it's only women who are transphobic, but you know, it's perpetuated as this women's movement against trans people. And again, actually some of the conspiracy theories are rooted in seeing, I don't know if people have heard of transhumanism, but it's basically this idea that people, I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it, but that people will be, eventually uploaded onto computers and that kind of idea, robotics and so on. But a Jewish trans woman wrote a book about transhumanism, and so therefore there must be a relation to the Rothschilds, and therefore Jewish people are again trying to make them trans. You know, these kind of ideas are actually really prominent online, and it's not very clear to see until you look into the deep roots of these kind of conspiracy theories. So I think we have to be really clear on like anti-Semitism, what that is, in a time when it's actually becoming extremely fearful for people because the world is in crisis. But more generally, we do actually have to provide a solution to those people about what the world could really look like. That fear is not based on other people. You should be looking at your neighbour to attack. You should be looking at the people at the genuine top of society, the capitalists, and they may, and that's how you need to actually change society. So the community to ask questions about this is not an easy answer. It's actually one that we really need to ensure happens, and that's why revolution is the most important.
I think it's true what Richard and Matt and others have been saying about the kind of deepening social crisis and the kind of left having to be the pole of attraction. Because the tragedy about conspiracy theories in lots of ways is they capture on a real anger and despair at what's going on, but they channel that despair into away from like movements for change, away from the left. And I always think about what happened during COVID, because I think it was so, see it happening in real time. It's like quite terrifying seeing this huge movement happening. But if you look at what like the kind of institutions of the left did during COVID, Labour basically said, we're now, we're facing a national emergency. We're working with the Tories basically to get through this crisis. Meanwhile, the Tories are, sending billions of pounds to their mates, setting up these, their mates setting up these companies. This enormous amount of corruption going on, and then, working class people facing, horror basically in the workplace, people dying on a mass scale. And what were the unions doing in some places? The unions were shutting up shop because it wasn't safe to be in a union office. Meanwhile, health workers are having to wrap themselves up in plastic bags, and it was just this like the institutions of the left that should have been, saying this is a disgrace, etc., were not leading a fight against what was going on at the time. And I think, and then you see this like huge, horrible movement that captured lots of people. I think actually a lot of them were, drawn from like small businesses and whatever that were facing closure, etc. But there was a huge base of support. So I think it's right that at those times the left has to be a pole of attraction and actually take on the kind of the disaster, that the deepening crisis that's going on, and not just block with the liberal kind of traditional right like they did in that point. And that's why I think the question of like the Popular Front or whatever in France is I think it raises that question, doesn't it? Because if you're somebody who's angry at what Macron and whatever have done in France, and and then you see the left stepping down to kind of let them in, there's a kind of question about the left and the liberal order working against you for the real insurgency. So I think we have to be quite hard about that. I know it's a hard question, but I think fighting for the kind of like a left independent pole that's prepared to prepared to take on that order I think is very important at this time, because I think we are in a dangerous situation where the far right are growing, and we can't just tap with what's the liberal order that's been going on for a long time, because people are fed up with it, and we want them to join us in a fight for a movement for change, not channel it into very reactionary politics.
See, I think this is very important for us today and the day after the election, because if you want to look for the figure in British politics who's peddling to the greatest extent ideas of great replacement and demonisation of George Soros, it's Nigel Farage. In the recent interview on LBC, he termed George Soros the greatest enemy of the Western world. And in that same framing, he argued that George Soros was the funder of Black Lives Matter, Stand Up to Racism, and so forth. They both claim again that people like Soros, Farage's words, both control international finance and the economy, and they fund revolt, protest and revolt by the left and from below. And I think Richard is absolutely right to argue that this is these ideologies are founded in capitalist society, and they emerged in capitalist society. And nothing is more true than modern anti-Semitism. It is framed by the architect of the term, who used it as a positive description, Wilhelm Marx, with the first great capitalist economic crisis of the 1870s. And he argued that the emancipation of Jews from the ghetto had allowed them to take control of the economy and to plant themselves in privileged positions and so forth throughout the society. But the last point I want to make about this is that it reaches its apex with Nazi ideology. But the important thing about it is they believed it. They believed it. You can't understand the Holocaust unless, which reached its apex at the end of the Second World War, without understanding that they actually believed that Jews were behind the alliance of Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, and so on. They couldn't understand why Churchill and Roosevelt would block with the Jew Bolsheviks unless there was Jews influencing the American policy, British policy, and so forth. And that ended in the most deadly genocide of the 20th century.
The first thing I just wanted to mention is the question of McCarthyism. I don't know that much about McCarthyism, but I do think it's interesting that throughout this period, including in the United States, the backlash to the socialist movement, particularly after the Russian Revolution, is so connected with anti-Semitism across the world. If you think about the United States before McCarthyism, in the early 1920s, you have the Palmer Raids, in which thousands of anarchists and communists are arrested across America in a huge clampdown during the first Red Scare. And it's in many ways directed at Jewish people who have come recently from Eastern Europe to escape anti-Semitism. And then you see this anti-Semitism and reaction fusing, anti-revolutionism fusing. And resulting in other forms of reactionary ideology, which flows into Jewish conspiratorialism. So, for example, in the 1920s, you get the emergence of the Second Ku Klux Klan, which at its peak had 5 million members. And this was an organisation. Sorry, I just saw some people's faces. Yes, it had 5 million members in the 1920s, I believe. And this was an organisation which fused elements of more traditional anti-Catholic conspiracy theories that had grown up in the United States with elements of this idea of Judeo-Bolshevism. You also see this sort of stuff articulated in the 1930s during the New Deal, where you have a man called Father Coughlin, a famous American far-right figure, basically the innovator of mass far-right propaganda, who also claims that the New Deal is a plot by the Jews, etc., etc. A plot by the Jews to make everyone not as poor. Terrible. Anyway, to come on to the question of transgender, the idea of a transgender conspiracy, I'm glad that people have talked about this because I think it's very, very interesting. Although I have to say, the radical feminist milieu is very, very small, but also very, very, I don't want to say this, but very, very strange and conspiratorial when you start to look at it. Like the conspiracy theories that are put forward about trans people are weird and horrendous. The idea that it's a plot to wipe out lesbians, you know, the idea that it's a plot to make the children gay, which is, you know, a common theme going back decades, to be honest. The idea, most disgustingly of all, the idea that it's an elite conspiracy to advance the elite's interest in paedophilia. That's become quite a common idea. And within the radical feminist milieu, it is actually connected to anti-Semitic ideology as well, as people have pointed out. The small organisation known as Deep Green Resistance is an anti-Semitic organisation that essentially argues that the trans agenda is transhumanism, making people into robots, a Jewish plot to make people into robots. I feel fucking stupid when I say this stuff. I'm sorry, I'm becoming more dumb when I'm telling you about these things. But I think it's really interesting because it displays an interesting facet of far-right conspiracism, which is that what it does is, it says that the conspiracy lies behind the deteriorating social conditions which people are angry about, but it also lies behind those forces in society which are rising up against it. It lies behind the women's movement, it lies behind feminism, it lies behind the workers' movement, it lies behind critical race theory in the United States. And you see this as you can see this as a really, really important organising feature of the US far right at the moment. One of the reasons why Trump is on course to get back into the White House. You've had 4 years of far-right agitation at the base of society, people going into their school boards, arguing over the question of trans-inclusive education, arguing against critical race theory, which is actually just teaching children about the history of the United States, which, I don't know whether people know this, but it's racist. It's quite racist. This thing called it's another meeting. There's some other meetings, but I'll leave other people to talk about it. But it identifies these progressive social forces and social movements as another side of the enemy. This is very, very key to how conspiracism operates in terms of far-right ideology, how it coheres movements, far-right social movements, how it coheres far-right political parties and so on. And this is why I actually want to take a bit of, I want to criticise a little bit the sort of blanket statement that conspiracy theories are about disillusionment and about alienation, and particularly that they're about powerlessness. Now, I do think that that's true to some extent. You can have situations in which they do express powerlessness. A really important example of this is the 9/11 conspiracy theories. The idea that there's only one agency in the world, and it's the cabal behind the US government, and people can't, you know, go into a plane and take it over and crash it into a building. You know, it expresses such a sense of powerlessness that we have no control over the world whatsoever, and it's just controlled by these people or whatever. But also, there is something empowering about conspiracist ideology in certain senses, precisely because it's used as a facet of far-right ideology and as a way of organising. The attack on the Capitol when in early 2021, am I correct? Great. I didn't say go for 3 hours sleep. In early 2021. Had at the heart of it a conspiracy theory. The idea that all of the election ballots were actually made up because, you know, the machines are outsourced to China or whatever. Are we really saying that the Nazis were disempowered by their belief in... No, they were empowered to carry out racist attacks against Jews and to carry out the Holocaust. So I think that the more universal prism through which to look at this is actually distrust. And distrust is really at the heart of all of this, particularly at the present moment. There is so much distrust of all of the central institutions of capitalist society at the present time. You saw it so clearly during the pandemic, where even medical science, even the chief medical officer in each of the different countries was being brought into disrepute by their association with the policies of the neoliberal centre. The process of neoliberalisation over the past few decades has discredited so much all of the main institutions of Western capitalism, and this is proved, by the way, by global surveys about trust, that measure trust of political institutions, of the media, of companies, and so on. You can see that it's been going down since the 1970s, according to these systematic surveys, in all of the countries in the West and in many other countries as well. And thank you. And it's most advanced in those countries that have gone most in the direction of dismantling the welfare state and undermining people's trust in the institutions. Now, there's a sort of liberal response to this, which is like, we have to defend the institutions then. You know, we have to get our fact checkers out. Every time someone does a conspiracy theory, we're going to fact check it. And then people will read it and then they'll know the truth. We're not interested in it. We're not interested in restoring trust in this completely discredited political system. And you see the distrust so much in British society. You saw it in Brexit. Yes, many people voted for Brexit because they didn't want any more immigrants. They were motivated by racism. Many people voted for Brexit because they wanted to give the government a bloody nose. And because it was a howl of rage, essentially, against the institutions. That was a major factor in it. You see it in the election that happened last night. Only 60% of people voted. All of the institutions of Western politics are in a crisis of legitimacy, and we have no interest whatsoever in trying to prop them up. How do we respond then? Well, I think that this is perhaps a good thing to say at the end of this first session on Friday. I think that the answer is Marxism, that is to say the ideology, not the event, although the event is very much part of that. Because we need a way of putting forward a systematic explanation of what is actually taking place in society. People are not stupid. People understand that they are living in a period of great crisis, a polycrisis, if you will, an integrated crisis on many different levels of human existence at the present time, a crisis of society, a crisis of our material living standards, a crisis of the environment, a crisis of imperialism, and we could go on and on and on about the crisis-ridden nature of the system at the present time. We need to be able to give a systematic explanation to people about what is actually driving those crises, so that we can win significant amounts of people to a coherent explanation of what's taking place in society and how to solve it, and so they don't get pulled into the far right and don't get pulled into conspiracism. And as Rob said at the end, and I'll finish here, it's extremely important that we do so. Perhaps I'll leave others to elaborate a proper political analysis of what took place last night later on in the event, given that I only slept for 3 hours. But I think that what we saw last night was the construction of an enormous sandcastle by the Labour Party. They've won this election with 500,000 less votes than Corbyn lost the 2019 election. And the truth is that there is the very real possibility in this country of a Tea Party moment where the far right becomes an enormous force, becomes the oppositional force to the Labour Party, and then we're faced with an extremely big problem. Not just an extremely big problem, but actually the fight of our lives. And this question of whether, in that situation, we look to shore up the system, to try to give it back legitimacy in order to hold off the far right, try to restore trust in the system, or whether we go our own way, break from Labourism, break from reformism, and lead people towards the destruction of the capitalist system, this is going to be an absolutely central question. The first approach has been tried in America, and it looks like it's failing. My suggestion is that we try the second approach in Britain, and hopefully it leads towards the destruction of this disgusting system which produces so much inequality and so much suffering, but at the same time also produces such a huge amount of ignorance, of lies, and of obfuscation, which disguises the nature of the system, and which leads people to these sort of pseudo-explanations of what's taking place in the world today.